Creepypasta is a subject that a lot of people acknowledge has become irrelevant. Once inescapable online, it's since been relegated to nothing more than a punchline. In spite of this, few have bothered to investigate why. In doing research for the subject, I found it to be an interesting case study of misinformation, urban legends, and the relationship between fantasy and reality. And the genre, which started off as nothing more than innocent fun, had to be neutered as it became too popular for its own good. I wasn't particularly afraid of horror films as a kid. I enjoyed watching them, but it often felt like a roller coaster ride. The fear would end with the film, as I could assure myself it was just entertainment. Apart from serial killers, what truly scared me were urban legends and the paranormal. They were much more difficult to dismiss at face value, as they weren't presented in a distinctly fictional setting. And the same concept applied to creepypasta. In the late 2000s, the internet was a place where both truth and fiction blended together far more easily. The origin of information was difficult to track, as it spread regardless of truth. Creepypasta came about when aspiring authors took note of this and appropriated it into a means of storytelling. It was these specific circumstances that allowed them to not function as horror stories, but urban legends. As the term implies, these legends always relate to the contemporary, and creepypasta was perhaps that idea at its purest. They resided in the familiar, with the most infamous tropes regarding entertainment. While nowadays this would make them easier to discredit, there was a far greater disconnect at the time between producer and consumer. Most were written in the first person to disguise them as anecdotes, a common technique among hoaxes at the time. Many even went so far as to imitate news sources. An infamous example of this is the Lavender Town frequency theory. Not only was the story written as if it were a formal piece of journalism, but evidence was then fabricated to substantiate it. This included both a scientific study and an interview with the game's art director. Another popular creepypasta, Candle Cove, took this even further. Centering around a fictional lost children's show, the reader is strung through a series of posts from a non-existent internet forum. This method of storytelling broke the fourth wall in ways other entertainment couldn't, making them difficult to discredit at first glance. It's a technique that was employed prior by films like the Blair Witch Project, whose marketing campaign framed the story as true events. This entailed an entire mockumentary and website hosting fictional police reports and missing person pages. The key difference between the Blair Witch Project and creepypasta, however, is that the former was a well-documented film. There's only so much you can obfuscate with a production like that, so for most, the novelty was lost with the end credits. With the internet, the truth can be hidden forever, and over the years, many have changed its landscape without anyone ever learning their true identity. Many of the urban legends we remember today had a series of events that single-handedly propelled it to public conscience. From Surgeon's photo of the Loch Ness Monster to the famous footage of Bigfoot, they popularized their respective cryptids. But they weren't the origins of the legend, simply their most famous incarnation. Even to this day, the origins of most popular creepypastas remain unknown. Take the aforementioned Lavender Town theory, whose first instance was an anonymous submission. But by far, the most interesting case is the debate over who created Jeff the Killer. As one of the most iconic faces in the genre, being able to claim credit for its creation would place you squarely in internet history. Now, technically there is an official backstory to the character, but honestly that's not what made him so popular. His own fan wiki admits it's considered one of the worst of all time. What single-handedly carried the story was the image attached to it. Interestingly, the author of the earliest known incarnation claims to have created that as well. However, his explanation simply doesn't add up. His claim, sourced from an interview with Scare Theater, is the following.
The picture was made using a white latex mask and some big plastic eyes with a red rubber substance that simulated blinking. There was also a black ring around the eyes that were on, covering the exposed red eyelid. After it was made, 2 or 3 pictures were taken and posted. The rest is history.
This makes absolutely no sense. It's pretty obvious that the eyes are not physically on the mask, and he makes no mention of the clear processing that was done on the image. So he didn't make the image. But if he didn't make Jeff, then who did? In the summer of 2013, an investigation into this question revealed a far more sinister possibility. It was alleged that the original image came from a woman who'd been harassed online. It claimed that this was Katie Robinson, and after posting an image of herself onto 4chan, anonymous posters began editing her face to mock her. This upset her to the point of committing suicide. The implication is that the famous image, or at least one of its prototypes, was the result of this bullying. And from a purely logistical and visual perspective, it genuinely seemed plausible, so for years this theory was accepted as reality. But slowly, cracks began to form in the narrative. Firstly, there were no death records for the supposed victim, but more importantly, the image of Katie was eventually traced to a different origin entirely. this person wasn't named Katie Robinson at all, instead being identified as a different woman who is still alive to this day. Further investigation found that the image had actually appeared online far before 2008, with the earliest instance tracing back to 2005 on a Japanese image hosting site. This is the closest the search got to pinpointing an origin, but even still, it was a dead end. To this day, the actual source of the image remains unknown. By now, you're probably wondering, what was the point in explaining all this? Well, it really highlights just how poorly documented the early internet was, and how that allowed these urban legends to prosper. The uncertainty doesn't just concern his existence, but on a meta level, his origin. With that said, not all creepypastas had their authors obscured. In fact, the indisputable face of creepypasta had very traceable origins back to something awful. And it's with Slender Man that we can examine just how complex the relationship between information and the internet is. Slender Man was created to intentionally mimic folklore, with sightings and fake news clippings to match. And while at first it was tongue-in-cheek, as the character grew in notoriety, people began to learn of him only through these qualities. Many even began to doubt the original thread's legitimacy, choosing to believe falsified historical documents instead. In perhaps one of the most extreme cases in Death of the Author, at the peak of its popularity, the character had entirely escaped his grasp. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. Knudsen was reserved, perhaps reluctant to embrace the publicity. Consequently, most know him only by his equally fictional username. Even to this day, interviews with him have yet to reach even just 10,000 views after a decade. He effectively became a footnote to his own creation.
In a way, Eric's in a situation he can't win. Every time the Slender Man appears in a forged historical document or a faux documentary photo, he becomes realer and scarier. And Eric disappears just a little bit more.
And while from a creative standpoint that's unfortunate, it was necessary for Slender Man to have the influence it did. In the same way the story used the language of folklore, it needed to mimic their lack of origin to truly be believable. And so, intentional or not, there was incentive for Knudsen to remain elusive.
He's like an open source creature. You can ascribe to him whatever trope or whatever you find frightening. And that's, I think, part of his appeal to a mass audience.
The character's collaborative nature is reminiscent of campfire stories, something Knudsen himself celebrated at the time. He recognized that this was a unique phenomenon, a perfect storm that created something beyond horror.
I find it like being my one shot as a creator in my life, and I don't necessarily just want to give that up.
So you can only imagine the shock then when in 2016 it was announced that a film based on the character had begun production. A film that, apart from being painfully boring, destroyed all of the things that made Slender Man unique by canonizing him as a horror character. With how bland and conventional it is, it's a stark contrast to statements Knudsen made only 2 years prior.
If there's going to be a commercial exploitation of the character, I just don't want to see something that's going to be lame. I just want something amazing to come of it. Something that's scary and disturbing and that's kind of different. I would hate for something to come out and just be kind of conventional.
Well, this interview was published on January 30th, 2014. Just 4 months later, the infamous Waukesha incident occurred, in which two 12-year-old girls attempted to stab a classmate to death to sacrifice her to Slender Man.
Okay, kind of tell me what happened. So, there's this website called the Creepypasta Wiki. Okay. It's full of, horror stories that are meant to purposely scare you through, online literature and all that. Okay. And there's one of them called Slender Man.
In the police interrogation tapes, one of the perpetrators directly stated that they thought the story was legitimate because of the lack of distinction between fiction and reality.
Then there's another killer called Jeff the Killer on the Creepypasta Wiki. Actually a real person, Jeffrey Woods. If you go on Google Images and search Jeffrey Woods news article, a bunch of news articles will come up. We're just like, okay, so we know at least Jeff is real. Okay. So we got our hopes up and thought that everybody else was real.
The two girls claimed that they were just acting as proxies, a term for those who served the faceless being. A concept entirely invented for the story bled into reality by genuine belief. Following the stabbing, creepypasta became the subject of a national moral panic. Accounts of other teenagers who'd been influenced by the genre began to surface. Shortly after the news broke, an admin for the community's wiki felt it necessary to reiterate that all of the characters were fiction. What previously was a method of storytelling unique to the internet was now a threat to public safety, and the city's police chief went so far as to issue a statement warning parents of the medium. Being at the forefront of this controversy, it became an imperative to demystify Slender Man. So with that in mind, what greater way to defang the character than to reduce him to nothing more than a Hollywood monster? Upon its release in 2018, Carly Veloci from The Verge called the Slender Man film the nail in the coffin of a dying fandom.
The pitiful reception of Slender Man the movie seems like the final nail in the coffin in a lot of ways. Those who had a hand in creating the creature online, meanwhile, saw the film as derivative and not doing justice to their story and what made it special. It included nothing of their history or any of the details about the lore. Nothing about it suggested the Slender Man story was any different than the standard Hollywood horror formula.
While the vast majority understood it was entertainment, by nature of its popularity, it was inevitable to inspire true believers. When you consider Knutson's opinion before and after the incident, and subsequent media outcry, it makes you wonder if this spiritual death of the character was intentional. It'd be foolish, however, to assume Slenderman's downfall entailed the entire decay of the genre. Horror online is still alive and well, but the specific novelties of creepypasta are missing. To some extent, this can be attributed to the public outcry, but there are other reasons for authors to prefer conventional horror. As a gimmick, it's captivating to stumble upon a story with no clear origin, but as we saw with Knudsen, the downside is a total disregard for the person behind it. In 2012, a creepypasta known as The Expressionless was published online. It quickly went viral and was narrated, reposted, and adapted across a multitude of different platforms. While uploads at the time simply titled it as an urban legend and nothing more, it did indeed have an author. While at the time he enjoyed the glamour of exposure and novelty in creating an urban legend, as the adrenaline faded, so did his appreciation. He later stated in an interview that as a 22-year-old author with no industry experience, it killed his love of writing for years. He received little to no credit and had requests for compensation denied by those who used his work. Creepypasta became an extremely profitable genre, to the point where entire communities spawned from monetizing them. If money is going to be made from these stories, it's only fair that the people actually writing them receive some reward. And aside from that, as the internet became better documented, the trend towards conventional horror was inevitable. Ultimately, this resolution is better than the alternative, even if it means the stories are now being presented as distinctly fictional. Creepypastas in their original form are effectively dead. For a single author to publish an original story and be seen as plausible on such a massive scale is unlikely in the present day. However, certain elements of the genre have continued to survive. But as you're about to learn, this may not have been for the best, as it's arguable these aspects constitute the medium's most dangerous. In July of 2018, a social media storm erupted in fear of a challenge being spread through WhatsApp. Known as the Momo Challenge, it claimed that players were being instructed to perform a succession of tasks that escalated to self-harm and eventually suicide. While first restrained to Facebook, it received global media coverage after several deaths were attributed to the phenomenon. Outcry over Momo continued into that next year, where it was alleged that the challenge had been hidden in YouTube videos intended for children. While not explicitly a creepypasta, it was certainly an urban legend, with no clear origin or substantiation. Even following the story at the time, I had no idea what was legitimate. So now that it's been 3 years, how much truth was there to the hoax? Common understanding of the incident states that the challenge itself had been entirely fabricated. This is something Rainbot herself states in her video predating the media outcry.
Now, things may seem to get messy from here on out, so please bear with me. I say that because this whole ordeal has become somewhat of an overnight urban legend in a sense, and as such, it's difficult to trace it back to a singular source or user. Finding screenshots of interactions with Momo is nearly impossible, and you'd think there'd be more for such a supposedly widespread thing.
She then makes the prediction that as it garnered popularity, copycats would appear, making the legend lose appeal.
Once this goes up alongside other English language videos covering the same topic, Momo is most likely to be so riddled with fakes and copycats that it'll completely lose its appeal.
She was entirely correct in her prediction that the story would incite copycats, but she was wrong in her belief that it would make the story lose appeal. This video was published weeks before the incident that made Momo so infamous. The reason the story received global attention was because it'd been attributed with the death of a 12-year-old girl in Argentina. The Wikipedia page for the controversy states that no link between her death and the challenge was ever confirmed by authorities. But upon reading the article, this isn't exactly the case. In fact, the actual purported link between Momo and her death is more horrifying than what's being reported. The article states that she'd been instructed to end her life by an unidentified adult she met online. Found with her phone nearby, authorities hacked into the device to find that she'd filmed her entire day. They were able to retrieve her WhatsApp message history, discovering the unknown suspect's existence. In the abstract, this sounds exactly like the Momo challenge, so where does the interpretation differ? The key is in their specific wording. Law enforcement believed the manipulator's intent was to upload the video to give credence to the challenge. The implication is that they read the urban legend and, in some bizarre attempt to substantiate it, did it for real. This pattern repeated itself when Momo resurfaced in 2019. The challenge returned to headlines after a mother claimed her son learned of the challenge through YouTube videos, a claim that was never substantiated with evidence. In fact, a YouTube spokesperson even went on record to state that they found no evidence of videos promoting the challenge on YouTube. It was only until 2 days after the article that these videos began to appear.
Hey, it's Momo again. That was the neat trick, huh, kids? Did you do everything Momo said to do last time? No, I need another favor. But don't worry, it's real easy, kids.
In spite of their previous statement, a week later, all videos discussing Momo were subsequently demonetized by YouTube. What once began as an urban legend preying on fears of child endangerment led to actual instances of it. What was an unfortunate repercussion for Slender Man became the only outcome of Momo, as all elements of storytelling were replaced with fear-mongering. In spite of everything, Creepypasta was intended to be entertainment. It appropriated misinformation to give an edge to otherwise innocuous horror stories. But that placement between fiction and reality is dangerous. Today, the only legends that persist are not intended to entertain, but cause unrest. And in many ways, that's indicative of the original sin of Creepypasta. What began as a co-optation for fun wound up being just as, if not more harmful than the hoaxes it once subdued.